Most people only know Douglas Howard, Lady Sheffield, as the woman who, had Robert Dudley's illegitimate son. But as Janet Wertman shows in this talk from Tudorcon 2024 last year, Douglas was so much more than a footnote in someone else's story. She survived Tower scandals, outlasted Elizabeth's temper, and ended up advising Catherine de' Medici because why not? So if you're into complicated women doing interesting things in impossible situations, this one's going to be for you. Just a reminder, Tudorcon 2025 is October 3rd through 5th at Agecroft Hall in Richmond, Virginia. And the early bird price for the live in-person tickets is actually going up at the end of the month. So just a few days left. So you can learn more at englandcast.com/TudorCon to learn more about coming in person. You can also, of course, watch from anywhere in the world on your couch or wherever's comfortable through Tudorcon From Home, the streaming version of Tudorcon, extra talks, a digital swag bag, all kinds of cool stuff. You can learn more about that and reserve your spot at englandcast.com/TudorCon From Home and enter the code EARLYBIRD to save $15 off of your ticket. Still have time to think about that, but if you want to come in person and get the early bird rate before the prices go up at the end of the month, you want to think about doing that in the next few days. So englandcast.com/TudorCon to come in person. All right, let's turn it over to Janet Wertman and learn more about Douglas Howard, Lady Sheffield.
Heather, I just want to thank you, Anne, thank you all for being here again. This is just incredible. I didn't think that anything could top a Renaissance fair at a wine bar, but I love that. My talk this year is about Douglas Howard, Lady Sheffield. How many of you know her? Okay, do you know her beyond the fact she had Robert Dudley's love child? Okay. So when I first told Heather about this talk, she said, "Why do we care about Douglas Sheffield?" And I said, "She had Robert Dudley's love child." And one of the things I realized was that that is kind of misogynistic, that we should care about her mainly because of a man. But this was the Tudor era, and one, and two, we care about that man because of a woman. So there's a little bit there. I believe there's something a lot more to Douglas. I think that her story is kind of emblematic of the Tudor era, but I'll let you decide when we're done. So let's start with her centrally located Tudor family. Okay, so the dad was William Howard, the son of Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk, the one who lost his title for a while after he fought for Richard III. That's the one who said, I was fighting for my crown sovereign. If Parliament had put the crown on top of the cat over there, I'd have fought the same for that cat. It worked somehow. Of course, that was Henry VII instead of Henry VIII. And people were not as disposable to Henry VII, but we'll get it. We don't hear a lot about William because he was from Norfolk's second marriage, and he was a good 30 years younger than his older brother, the third Duke of Norfolk, and he got much less attention. The third Duke of Norfolk, as we all know, took all the oxygen in the room that Henry wasn't using. But that gave William the chance to marry and start his family. He and his wife would go on to have 4 sons and 5 daughters. So I went a little bit too soon over there. Okay, this is Douglas's family specifically. I'm not going to tell you about all of the others. Oh, I'm missing a picture too. 3 of William Howard's children would go on to have major careers at court. Charles, his heir, born in 1536, Douglas, born in 1542-43, and Francis, born around 1545. Now, you're going to notice the dates that I've just given. 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed. 1541, Catherine Howard. This was not an easy time to be a Howard, especially William. We all know that the Duke escaped consequences by throwing Catherine under the bus and retiring from court. but William was 30 years younger. That made him only about 13 years older than his niece, Catherine Howard. William was living with the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk while all of the stuff was going on in that household. So when Catherine's indiscretions were found, William and two of his sisters were thrown into the Tower for hiding the information. They were convicted, they pled guilty and begged for mercy, and they were sentenced to life imprisonment. But once Catherine Howard was executed, Henry's vindictiveness kind of fell away, so they were pardoned. Things improved when Henry married Catherine Parr and went to war, and there was no better way to get on a monarch's good side than going to fight for him. William accompanied Edward Seymour's forces to Scotland, charmed Henry during the Battle of Boulogne, and that got him named Vice Admiral under John Dudley. Then, at the very end of Henry's life, when Douglas was about 5, the whole Howard family got rearranged. Norfolk's son, Surrey, that was the, I'm doing that. That was, he was too confident that his father would become sole regent, or maybe Edward Seymour kind of sabotaged things. There are a lot of different stories as to what happened to Surrey at the end of Henry's life, but he was arrested for ordering the royal arms, which technically he did have the right to. He died, but Norfolk was thrown in jail, escaped death by mere hours, because Henry died first, and then he spent the rest of Edward VI's reign in the Tower. That allowed our boy William to come into his own, or to start to. I say start because William was not named to the Privy Council, but he was part of court. He backed Northumberland against Somerset because, remember, he had served as Vice Admiral under John Dudley, so there was that connection there. As a reward, he was named Lord Deputy and Governor of Calais. That was a Privy Council position. That, the governorship of Calais, meant that Douglas spent formative years in France. Well, in England, in France, but still in France. She was about 10. She was still too young to consider marriage, but if you remember the kind of effect that being brought up and having, you know, a French sensibility did to Anne Boleyn, it kind of did that for Douglas as well, but we'll get to that. Key point for now, when Mary suddenly came to the throne in 1553, William held Calais for her, and that got him Mary's favor. It didn't let him keep his post. She called him back, but he made it back just in time to raise an army, and he was one of the principal people who fought Wyatt's rebellion for her. And so right there, he got put on the Privy Council. He was named Baron Howard of Effingham. He was named Knight of the Garter. He was named Lord Admiral. He didn't remain Lord Admiral for long. He supported Elizabeth's claim to the throne at a time when Mary was trying to get Elizabeth removed from the succession. So he was never actually under suspicion, but he lost the admiralcy. When he did that, he was in a bit of a bad position, but then Elizabeth took the throne. So Elizabeth was 25 when she was crowned, and to thank William for his support, because it really did help, she made him Lord Chamberlain and gave the 15-year-old Douglas a place in her household. Jackpot. Some notes about what that meant. That was the entire social system. Young men and women would join the household of a higher up to complete their education, to meet a future husband, to rise in the world. I mean, yes, marriage was a completely economic argument arranged by the parents, but there was a little bit of, if you were at court, you were automatically, you got bonus points for that, in addition to where your family was. So point being, Douglas was in great shape to marry, but before we talk about the marriage that she made, I'm going to make a tiny little detour. The first few years of Elizabeth's reign were the ones where talk of her marriage were everywhere. And the one name that keeps on cropping up, even though he was married, was Robert Dudley. Now you're looking at this going, why are you showing me tennis and talking about marriage? And it seems random, but this amazing story comes down to us where there were official tennis games and then there were competitive fun tennis games. And in the competitive fun tennis games, the men used to play in their shirts. And Elizabeth wanted to go watch Robert Dudley play tennis. So she couldn't, because that just would have been completely improper. So she disguised herself as Douglas's maid. And they both went to go watch Robert Dudley play tennis. Now, we'll get back to the main storyline where the whole idea of a position at court was to find a husband. So marriage was an expectation of society. It was one of the sacraments. As we said, few Tudor women married for love, but women were expected to accept their husband's choice of groom. If you were one of Elizabeth's ladies, it wasn't hard. It took Douglas about a year to find a good husband. In 1560, she married a rich peer, John Sheffield, second Baron Sheffield. So he was born in 1538. I could not get a good picture. Believe me, he was about 4 years older than Douglas. He was the son of Edmund Sheffield, first Baron Sheffield, second cousin once removed of Henry VIII, and Lady Anne de Vere, daughter of John de Vere, the 15th Earl of Oxford. That's where, I really had to, grab to get this picture. There was a Boleyn connection as well. Edmund's father died when he was only 10, and Edmund's wardship was granted to George Boleyn, though in 1536 it had to be transferred to John de Vere. Another detour for context, and I know we kind of touched on this yesterday in talking about William Cecil. When a peer died, leaving behind a minor child, the king had a feudal interest in all of the revenues of that estate, other than the widow's 1/3 dower right, until the heir reached the majority age of 21. The king usually sold those wardships to the highest bidder, or gave them free to a favored courtier as a reward for services. You'll see why I mention this later. Back to Edmund, whose wardship was transferred to John de Vere. A frequent outcome of wardships was marriage. You all know the story, Catherine Willoughby and the Duke of Suffolk. And that's how Edmund came to marry Anne de Vere and have 3 daughters and 2 sons, including John. John and Douglas went on to have 2 children, a son, Edmund, born in 1565, and a daughter, Elizabeth, born before December 1568. We say before December 1568 because that was when John died. And remember, John was a peer, and according to the Dictionary of National Biography, Edmund Sheffield's wardship appears to have been granted for a short time to Robert Dudley. So not long after John's death, Douglas returned to court, both as a job for her and to see her son regularly. That put her in close contact with Robert Dudley, and they started up an affair. We know this was an affair. This was not just rumors, because in 1574, she bore him a son out of wedlock. This was kind of a thing. We were talking yesterday about how illegitimate children, also referred to as natural children, had a tough time in Tudor England. They couldn't legally own or inherit titles. Even inheriting property was a little bit of an issue. They couldn't hold public or ecclesiastical office, and a bunch of things. And a woman who bore a child out of wedlock, that was a real thing. Now, Douglas did try to get him to marry her. And both before she had the boy and after she had the son, her position was actually better than it had been before, because Robert Dudley really wanted an heir. He didn't have one, and Ambrose didn't have one. The two of them had these earldoms. They had manor houses, but big manor houses and titles and all of that, and they have no one to leave their assets to. And we know that Robert Dudley wanted an heir, and we have a letter, an amazing letter, and I'll send it to anyone who wants it, where he details why he's saying no, and he's saying, I can't marry you. It would mean mine utter overthrow. And he reminds her that he's been honest throughout. As I have told you at the first and sundry times, pretty declared plainly to you. And it also didn't help that while Douglas was trying to pressure him into marriage, she also had rivals. Her own sister, Frances Howard, who would go on to secretly marry Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford, in 1582, 1583. Okay, I can't help myself. A little bit of a detour. This would be Hertford's second clandestine marriage. His first to Catherine Grey got him thrown into the Tower. This one did as well, because secrecy was a problem. It wasn't just meddling with the succession. But remember that Francis's and Douglas's brother was Charles Howard, Baron Effingham, who was close to Elizabeth himself, and whose wife Cathy was one of Elizabeth's favorite ladies. So Elizabeth ended up forgiving them. Edward Seymour got out of the Tower. He would go on to make a third clandestine marriage to a second Frances Howard. but that's a story for another time. So back to court, back to talk about Douglas's second rival, Lettice Knollys. More of a rival, since Lettice would actually go on to marry Robert Dudley on September 21, 1578. I know what you're thinking. It's like, wait a minute, what changed? What happened to mine utter overthrow? Well, if you remember my talk last year, and I do expect you all have notes, I'm kidding. In August 1578, the court paid its last visit to Kenilworth, and Robert Dudley put out all the stops in his last-ditch effort to get Elizabeth to marry him. She was a little bit too old at the time, but he was like, this is it, the whole play is better, and she said no. That was August, and he married Lettice on September 21. So the marriage was kept secret. We talked about that yesterday, but it could not have been comfortable for Douglas. A little more than a year later, on November 29th, 1579, Douglas married Sir Edward Stafford, whose mother, Dorothy Stafford, was very influential with the Queen, mistress of the robes. It was also another family thing. Dorothy Stafford was the second wife of William Stafford, the widower of Mary Boleyn. So I'm going to go into a bit of a background here because this is kind of fun. What we usually hear about Mary Boleyn's William Stafford was that he was a commoner, which made his marriage to Mary embarrassing for her sister, then Queen Anne Boleyn. And we get Mary's cutting reply in her letter to Cromwell that she would rather be his wife than a queen. But there's a little bit more to that. So Mary's actual quote was not just the piece we always hear, for well, I might have had a greater man of birth and a higher, but I assure you I could never have had one that loved me so much. It didn't stop there. She went on to say, nor a more honest man, and besides that, he is both come of an ancient stock, and again is meet if it was his grace's pleasure to do the king's service as any gentleman in court. Now, Mary was stretching a little bit hard here. William was born to a prominent family of landed gentry, and he was vaguely related to the Stafford family that held the dukedom of Buckingham. But William was the second son, so the family money didn't help. And Buckingham had been executed for treason, so the family didn't really help there either. Whatever. After Mary died in 1543, William remarried Dorothy Stafford, another Stafford, yes, his cousin. She had the Stafford pedigree. She was the youngest daughter of Henry Stafford, 1st Baron Stafford, himself the son of the executed Duke of Buckingham. Yeah, Henry Stafford didn't have a picture either. As I said, there's some of these I had to stretch. Her mom was Ursula Pole, who was Margaret Pole's daughter, the poor 8th Countess of Salisbury, last surviving member of the Plantagenet dynasty. So William and Dorothy, our new super Stafford couple, had 6 children. The oldest, Edward, was born in 1552. He studied at St. John's College, Cambridge, and Pembroke College, Cambridge. He also benefited when Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558. As I said, his mom, Dorothy, was made mistress of the robes. He became a member of Parliament in 1571 and 72 before coming to court in 1573. Likely through the influence of his mom, William Cecil hired him to carry his secret letters because William Cecil had secret letters. William Cecil had a lot of secrets, as we've heard. He married Roberta Chapman during the early 1570s. They had 1 son and 2 daughters. When Roberta died during her 4th pregnancy in 1578, Edward came back to court. And remember, if you were at court in 1578, you were talking about one thing and one thing only: the secret marriage. So, as I said earlier, you really have to feel for Douglas because it was inevitable that her name would come up every time in connection with the story, because this was the story of the century. This was Robert Dudley, Elizabeth's Robert Dudley. It was one thing for him to sire an illegitimate son. That's how Douglas was brought in, but now he's married. So right during this maelstrom of gossip and everything, she and Edward Stafford fell in love, and they married in 1579. There was a hiccup. They almost didn't. When Elizabeth found out about Robert Dudley's secret marriage, the first thought was to invalidate it. Remember, she did that with Edward Seymour and Catherine Grey, and that had worked really well. So she's like, I'm going to do this with Robert Dudley and Matisse as well. She said, Douglas, you were married to him. You had his son. And give Elizabeth credit, she let Douglas off the hook. Douglas said, please don't make me do this. Really, don't make me marry him. Elizabeth let her off the hook, allowed her to marry Stafford. And then right after that, he left to France to work towards the marriage that was being worked on between Elizabeth and Alençon. A little bit of background, a little bit slightly, I'm not going over what we heard yesterday, but a little bit. Alençon was the 4th youngest son of Henry II and Catherine de' Medici. He, at the time, was the next heir to the throne because his 2 oldest brothers died young. Francis II at 16, Charles IX at 24. He was the smartest of Elizabeth's suitors because he focused on the wooing. He sent Simier to charm Elizabeth on his behalf, and Simier acted like a love-struck, so excited. He flirted like crazy. He stole the royal nightcap. Leicester, which was Robert Dudley at this point, was complaining vociferously about that because he was politically opposed to a French marriage. And as we heard, Simier was the one to tell Elizabeth about Leicester's own marriage, knowing it would make Elizabeth more likely to go through with it to show him. And it almost worked. It is what persuaded Elizabeth to send Stafford to France to charm their court, and Stafford brought his new bride, Douglas, with him. The court they went through was ruled by Henry III. Though he had little interest in the tasks of government, he left that mainly to his mom, who fully accepted Douglas. Now, remember, Douglas had spent time in France. She was beautiful. She was related to the Queen. She was sophisticated. She became a prominent member of French society and actually besties with Catherine de' Medici, and even advised her about a reform of the French royal household. They never actually got dressed up and went to see people go play tennis, but they got along extremely well. Quick detour, in case you were wondering, and so you don't worry. Robert Dudley took responsibility for his son. He brought the boy also named Robert Dudley, coincidence, I think not, to live with him when he was around 2. When Douglas left for France, little Robert remained in England under his mother's care. Leicester did right by him. He gave him an excellent education, Christ Church, Oxford in 1587, with the status of Earl's son, gave him army experience, brought him to the Netherlands, brought him to Tilbury to face the Armada in 1558. And then later, in 1558, that had died, he left little Robert the bulk of his estate, everything that he didn't leave to the Tees because they had no living children. Back to Douglas. She would have experienced a lot in the French court. She was there when Alençon died in 1584 of malaria after losing Antwerp. The English were not the only ones supporting the Netherlands against Spain. She was there when Catherine de' Medici died in 1589, followed by Henry III in August. At that point, the next successor was Henri of Navarre, but because he was a Protestant, the Guises allied themselves with Spain and the Pope to create a Catholic league to hold the throne themselves, which means that in 1590, diplomatic ties were loosened and Stafford was recalled. Douglas returned not only to England, but came back to Elizabeth's household. With sister-in-law Cathy and brother Nottingham, she was once again at the center of things. That brought her son to the fringes of court. He made a little bit of a name of himself. He was a little bit of a rake. He was briefly banished for kissing Margaret Cavendish in Elizabeth's presence, but he married her in 1591, so he was excused. He assembled a fleet of ships to harass the Spanish. Fun fact, in January 1595, he discovered an island near Trinidad that he claimed for the English crown and named the Liana. In 1596, he joined Essex and Nottingham in the triumphant expedition against Cadiz, serving as commander of the Nonpareil. Speaking of Essex, remember, little Robert was not only Douglas's son and a Howard, he was also Essex's stepbrother, and they were close. Little Robert went to Ireland with Essex and was part of that fiasco where more than 17 out of the 20,000 sent died. We don't hear about little Robert for a bit because Essex, like Norfolk once did, takes up all the air in the room. But during the Essex Rebellion, little Robert was at Essex House with Essex, while Douglas was in Elizabeth's rooms with Elizabeth. So that was a little bit of a strangeness, but Elizabeth was merciful for just about everyone, and then died not very long after that. And Douglas was one of the attendants that was with her at the end. Douglas remained at court during the new reign, as did her son. She does not appear to have become besties with Anne of Denmark. There were complaints that Anne favored the young women of the court rather than those who had been Elizabeth's friends. Perhaps that wasn't surprising because Anne was only 28 and Elizabeth's ladies were at least a generation older than her. In 1603, little Robert decided to try to prove his legitimacy because he wanted to inherit the earldom of Leicester and other properties from his uncle Ambrose Dudley. This time, Douglas participated. His case made it to the Star Chamber in 1605 after Edward Stafford had died. So Douglas could just, say anything she wanted. 90 witnesses appeared for Dudley, 57 for the widowed Countess of Leicester. Douglas declared in writing she did not attend the trial in person, that Leicester had solemnly contracted to marry her in Cannon Row, Westminster in 1571, and that they were married at Esher, Surrey in wintertime in 1573. Asked why, or explaining why, since she wasn't attending, why she had married Edward Stafford or claimed to have married Edward Stafford, she claimed that Leicester tried to poison her. This was like the 4th or 5th person to claim that Leicester tried to poison them. They were like, people, but there were a lot of people that Lester let poison. Life being sweet, she had decided to marry the safeguard of her life. All the putative witnesses, besides others to the ceremony, they were all dead. She couldn't remember who the minister was. This was very Catherine Gray-like. She couldn't remember who the minister was. She had no witnesses. She couldn't even remember the exact date of the marriage. And the Star Chamber rejected it and fined several of the witnesses. Douglas died peacefully not too long after that, and her son left England and settled in Tuscany. Although fighting with James, he somehow got Emperor Ferdinand II to recognize his claim to his grandfather's title of Duke of Northumberland. James did not appreciate that and severed all negotiations for conciliation. P.S. After James died, Charles I created Dudley's second wife, Alice, Duchess of Dudley, for the rest of her life, and recognized Dudley's legitimacy, though he didn't just restore the titles and estates. So Douglas was vindicated. At which point I want to come back and revisit Heather's question. Why do we care about Douglas Howard? We know her largely because of the men in her life. We can also say that about 4 of Henry's 6 wives, and most of the other women of the Tudor era. Hers is a quintessential Tudor story, and she made some really cool choices. After Dudley dumped her, she did not let Elizabeth use her for her own ends. She stood up to the Queen. She refused to get saddled with a marriage that she didn't want. She was clearly incredible on her own, sophisticated and smart. She was a confidant to 2 queens and was with Elizabeth both at the beginning and at the end of her reign. And it's just a really great story. So that's basically it. Questions?
I've got a newbie question. I'm a Tudor newbie, so I don't know why. Why was she named Douglas?
I have no idea. I'm going to guess it was somebody's last name that they used, but it might not have been. It was that was her name. I know. If you try to ask about Douglas Howard, everybody always assumes he was a man. It was not.
She knows. I don't know. I read somewhere that she's named after her grandmother, which was Elena Douglas. Which you still like. I love it in your ending, like, yeah.
Yes, no, that was it. I guess it was pretty complete. You completed it. Yeah, we're very happy. Thank you, Janet. You guys, this was it. In the books. Okay, so this is the part where normally we take our group picture. So we would still like to take our group picture. So we will go out into the courtyard, and Jonathan has the good camera and he's going to take a picture for us. And so we will do that, and then we're free to go. I know a lot of us have long drives and people want to get on the road, so we will do that. Thank you to Agecroft so much for hosting us. And you actually came to the very first Tudorcon in Lancaster and had brochures about Agecroft that you asked if you could pass out. And it's so great that now 5 years later we are here, and I'm just so happy. Thank you to all of the speakers. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you. Oh yeah, I will say, and thank you to the streamers who were here.
Oh yeah, and the streamers too. You can, if you want to come next year, I will have a link where you can also get the attendee price for that'll be up for a week as well. So thank you guys so much. And the recordings for everybody, you'll all get the recordings because you came. We have everything recorded, and I will send that out by Tuesday afternoon, evening-ish. So if you missed anything live, if some of you weren't here on the first night, here in person, you want to go back and look at that, we will send out all of the recordings by Tuesday evening. I think, do I have anything else I need to say? Surveys, yes, we've got the surveys, and, or please, here's another one somebody handed me. Yeah, and so do surveys. And also then if you guys are, anybody who's local or who wants a little snack, we still have a lot of leftovers from breakfast, so go back and help yourself. The coffee's probably cold, but you know, you can definitely. Yeah, exactly. Nice coffee. And just thank you guys so much for coming and being with us in our new space, and just excited to see where this goes from here. I love all the enthusiasm, and everybody just thank you for making this such a wonderful event today. All right, so we will just head out into the courtyard and take our group picture.